welcome to the Hindu discussion video for 27 February 2026. So we are going to discuss important thing which will be important for only from the perspective of our examiners. Okay, we are not going to do anything which does not have any link with our examiners. Okay, so there is nothing good. So we'll go for the editorial base. Okay. So editorial, you have analyzing India's cycle of deprivation and affluence. Okay, so in analyzing India's cycle of deprivation and affluence. Okay, so prima facie, it seems that they are going to discuss about the increasing inequality in India. Okay, so let us try to understand what they are going to do. Okay, so here I think now it will be much more clear to all of you. Okay, so let us start. So how what will be the approach of this discussion? So I will be reading out all things of the tutorial first. Okay, and simultaneously I will also try to interpret all those things. Okay, make you understand. Okay, in a very simple language with examples. Okay, so that is the thought process. Okay, so let us start. So it was the best of times. It was the worst of times, wrote Charles Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities. Two cities. This sums up the state of affairs in India in the past decades or so. Of particular interest here is the income mobility of different segments of population, which reveals sharp upward and downward shifts between 2014 and 2025. Those experiencing downward mobility among the poor suffer humiliation, hunger, morbidity, infant and child mortality, while the affluent experiencing upward mobility flaunt their wealth in ostentatious living, speculative investment in real estate, business ventures, and high risk gambling. So, movements into and out of deprivation and affluence are of considerable interest. All these changes are likely to influence income distribution that cannot be captured through poverty and income inequality measures. Instead, we demonstrate below that analysis of income mobility during the period 2014 to 25 yields richer insights into income distribution outcomes. The overall picture has shades of gray, but it is not counterintuitive. The state of households. Households are grouped each year into three income categories based on their 2014 per capita income rank. Top 10%, next 40%, and the bottom 50%. Income mobility is defined as movement across these groups relative to households 2014 position downward to a lower group, no change or upward to a higher group. Uh, To assess whether elections matter, the period 2014 to 25 is divided into two sub-periods. 2014 to 19 and 2019 to 24 is anchored around a national election year. Our analysis draws on real inflation adjusted per capita income data from the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey conducted by Center for Monitoring Indian Economy spanning 2014 to 25. We construct a balanced panel of households that are consistently observed across these years. At the all India level, the share of households experiencing downward mobility nearly doubles from 14% to in 2015 to 26%, 26.8% in 2025, while the proportion remaining in the same income group falls sharply from 70% to below half. So what is happening that those who are experiencing those households means those families who are experiencing downward mobility. Downward mobility means their income are going down. Okay, with respect to the inflation. Okay, so that number has been double. Okay, so earlier in 2015 it was 14%. Now it is 26.8% in 2025, while the proportion remaining in the same income group falls sharply from above 70% to below half. Upward mobility does increase over time, rising from 14.1% to 23.5%. Okay, so they are also saying that the upward mobility has also increased from 14.1 to 23.5%. Okay, it means that There were many people who were able to increase their income. However, at the same time, there were many people who were not able to increase their income. Hence, they noticed decrease in their income. Okay, but this improvement is gradual and consistently trails the rise in downward movement. What stands out is not just mobility, but it's a direction. The balance tilts increasingly towards decline rather than ascent. By 2025, more than one in four households are worse off relative to their 2014 position. The data suggests an economy marked less by a broad based upward progress and more by growing vulnerability and uneven gains. The rural trends are particularly sobering. By 2025, nearly 29% of rural households are worse off than they were in 2014, while the share that remained in the same income group has fallen below half. Although some upward movement is visible, especially in the early years, it is consistently outpaced by the rise in households slipping down the income ladder. The sharpest deterioration occurs in the first sub period 2014 to 19, but the vulnerability persists thereafter. Urban India fares somewhat better, yet the picture is hardly reassuring. Downward mobility rises here too, albeit more gradually than in rural areas, even as upward mobility improves at a faster pace than in the countryside. The contrast suggests that whatever gains have materialized are more concentrated in the urban centers, while rural households bear the brunt of economic volatility. Far from the story of broad based inclusion, the evidence points to a widening experience of insecurity, one that sits uneasily with vociferous claims of steadily falling inequality. Caste patterns. The caste-wise patterns are equally revealing and troubling. Since 2014, downward mobility has risen across all social groups, with particularly sharp increases among OBCs and scheduled caste households. Caste-wise patterns are equally revealing and troubling. Since 2014, downward mobility has risen across all social groups, with particularly sharp increase among other backward castes and scheduled caste. By 2025, roughly a quarter or more of households in each of these groups are worse off than they were in 2014. While upward mobility has improved for the unreserved and OBC, while the upward mobility has improved for unreserved and OBC, it remains muted and uneven for SCs across the entire period. For scheduled caste household, the constant appears less about dramatic descent and more about the persistent narrowing of pathways upward. The steepest rise in downward mobility occurs in the first sub period 2014-19, even as upward mobility loses momentum in the years thereafter. This sits uneasily with repeated assertions by the ruling party and the prime minister about shrinking inequalities and expanding opportunity. At the same time, At the same time, there has been considerable social churn, with the ruling party broadening its base, particularly among OBCs and sections of upper caste in states such as Uttar Pradesh, reshaping traditional hierarchies of influence within the broader caste landscape. Our analysis echoes a longer history of caste-based deprivation in India, where occupation segmentation, unequal access to assets and education, and intense social discrimination continue to shape income in economic outcomes. Scheduled tribes display comparatively lower downward mobility and some episodes of stronger upward mobility, possibly reflecting targeted interventions and region development efforts. Yet the broader message is unmistakable. Caste remains a decisive fault line in income mobility, and the promise of equal economic asset remains illusory. Relative to 2014, downward mobility rises across all religious groups, with the rise being more pronounced among both Hindu and Muslim households over time. Upward mobility increases steadily for Sikhs and Christian households, often outpacing downward movements in several years, while gains from Hindu and Muslim households are more gradual, indicating uneven mobility trajectories across religious groups by 2025. Among Hindus and Muslims, downward mobility spikes around election years, while upward mobility rises more modestly. For Muslims in particular, the rise in upward mobility remains weaker than the Hindus. Again, discrimination against Muslims has restricted their upward mobility and not so much their downward mobility. Sikh and Christian households display a stronger upward mobility in the earlier years, though this momentum begins in the later half of the decade. The story is about entrenched inequality. The story is about entrenched inequality. While the headline numbers point to growing downward mobility, a more rigorous statistical analysis reinforces the same conclusion. After accounting for household characteristics, we find that higher income dispersion at the district level is systematically associated with greater downward mobility. In other words, households located in more unequal districts are more likely to slip down the income ladder than the climb up. Inequality, far from spurring aspiration appears to harden economic boundaries. The results also echo familiar social fault lines. Households from historically disadvantaged caste groups and Muslim exhibit significant lower mobility, while education, urban location, and larger household size are associated with better prospects. The deeper story then is about interest in quality shaping who moves ahead and who falls behind. The 2019 mark a turning point is not as surprising as the Bharatiya Janata Party secured a historic victory in the general election. But soon after, the government had to deal with the catastrophic COVID-19 pandemic that caused massive humanitarian and economic crisis. Their inept handling means the disruption persisted long after the pandemic ceased. Reckless pursuit of Hindutva without a coherent strategy to revive the informal sector, including agriculture, lower increase in upward income mobility, while reliance among certain segments, including OBCs, SCs, as well as Muslims, help slow their descent into deprivation. So perhaps reliance in the face of deprivation adversity matters too. The larger concern is that an economy in which more households are slipping down than the climbing up cannot sustain social stability for long. When inequality hardens into reduced mobility, frustration replaces aspiration. Therefore, policy must move beyond headline growth and focus on strengthening public health, education, employment, and employment-intensive sectors and social protection. Policies addressing discrimination are not matters of welfare alone; they are central to restoring mobility and renewing faith in economic progress. So this editorial is all about how households incomes of certain sections are increasing, uh, or have witnessed the increasing rate from the period 2014 to 25. However, there are certain categories or the social categories of who have witnessed this income trend declining. So that is the downward mobility. Okay, so these are OBCs, SCs, STs, and Muslims. So this is what they are trying to say. They are trying to highlight that the economic development which is happening is not benefiting to all. It is benefiting only to few. So that is what they are trying to say. Okay. Uh, by the way, this was a wonderful article. I think I must appreciate that this was a wonderful article. You must understand if you going to write means particularly in the GS paper first and GS paper this is going to immensely helpful. Okay, so you can quote these things as well. These data they have provided. You can see here. Okay, these data they have provided. You can just see. You can just zoom it or pause the video and take the quick note of the highlighted things that I have already done. Okay, I hope that this much is clear. So we'll do next discussion in the separate lecture video. Okay, so which will be on the, let us see this this or something else. Okay, so we'll meet again.